Welcome to Heart of the Shepherd. We are continuing our study now in the book of Esther, our scripture reading chapter 2 and 3. The title of our devotional today, When Godly Men Confront Evil Edicts and Opportunists. I invite you to open with me to Esther chapter 2. Well, our first Bible study for the book of Esther introduced four key characters. Ahasuerus, who was the king of Persia, also known in the scriptures as Xerxes. He reigned over Persia for 21 years from 486 to 465 BC. And then there was Vashti, queen of Persia. She was banished from the kingdom when she refused to be paraded in front of men at a drunken feast. Now there is a gap of several years between Esther 1 and Esther 2, and the events recorded in Esther 1 occurred during the third year of Ahasuerus' reign as the king of Persia, while the setting of Esther 2 was during the seventh year of Ahasuerus' reign, Esther 2 and verse 16. Now the scriptures do not recognize or record the events that occurred during those 4 years. However, secular history does enlighten us, and we know that Ahasuerus, the king of Persia, waged a campaign against a confederacy of Greek city-states that became the Greek Empire. Now, King Ahasuerus suffered a loss, and his Persian navy was destroyed. So he retreated to his palace in Shushan and defeated and discouraged. Consider then with me Esther 2. Here we find in the opening verses a despairing king. And so we read in verse 1 of chapter 2, after these things, Ahasuerus returned to his palace, and we read that he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Now, the word remembered means that his memory of Vashti, his queen, burned in his heart. Now, the king returned home, not to celebratory parades, but to a humbled nation. And passing through the gilded doors of his palace, we read that the king remembered Vashti and his rash decree. So the king's servants realized the king's loneliness, and they suggested a search for fair young virgins to fill the void left by Vashti's departure. And so the search for a queen began in earnest as the most desirable maidens of the realm were gathered. Now the search set in motion a series of events that would eventually propel a Jewish maiden named Hadassah from anonymity to the throne of Persia. Verses 2 through 4. Let's consider then this Jewish virgin who became queen. Now, some 50,000 people of the tribes of Benjamin and Judah had returned to Israel. However, many Jews chose to remain in Babylon, and among them was a Jewish man named Mordecai. Now, Mordecai was a powerful, influential citizen of Shushan and had taken into his household Hadassah. Now, her name meant myrtle or fragrance. Her Persian name was Esther, which means star. Mordecai adopted her as his daughter after the premature deaths of her parents. Now, while the deaths of her parents were tragic, we will see that Esther being adopted by Mordecai was part of God's sovereign providential plan for her life. Esther was blessed with beauty, and her life and testimony served as a lasting testimony of God's grace. Well, look with me at verses 8 through 20, and here we have what I would describe as a royal marriage and a wedding feast. Now, Esther's beauty and humble demeanor gained her favor with Hegai, the keeper of the women, that is the king's harem. And we read, out of the king's house, Hegai preferred her, that is Esther, and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. As discreet as she was beautiful, Esther obeyed Mordecai and did not reveal to any that she was Jewish. Loving and mindful of the possible peril in which Esther found herself, Mordecai, we read, walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. Esther 2 and verse 11. Well, after 12 months of purification, we read that the king summoned each maiden to his chamber in verse 13. And yet, according to verse 14, the king had found no delight in any of the women. Well, Esther's beauty and humble demeanor, however, had already in verse 15 obtained her the favor in sight of them that looked upon her. And so when she was called before Ahasuerus in verse 16, we read, the king loved Esther above all the women as she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Now, Esther's crowning as the queen of Persia was celebrated by the king and the leaders of his realm in verses 18 and 19. And nevertheless, Esther honored the wisdom of her elder Mordecai and did not reveal her Jewish heritage to any. And then we have a moment here of intervention by Mordecai, and it was to save the king's life, verses 18 through 23. Now Esther 2 then concluded with Mordecai, we read, sitting in the king's gate, where he learned of a plot to assassinate the king. Well, by giving Esther the names of the insurgents, she endeared Mordecai to the king in verse 22, and his loyalty, we read in verse 23, was recorded in the book of the Chronicles before the king. Well, a closing thought for Esther 2 before we consider Esther 3. Now, Esther experienced the deaths of her father and mother, and her life might have been defined by bitterness. Instead, she chose to accept the Lord's will with grace and submission. And so her beauty and her humility provided a path for the Lord to promote her to serve him as the queen of Persia. Now let's consider then, as we look at this unfolding of events, Esther chapter 3. Now notice that Esther 3 begins with the phrase, again, after these things, giving us pause to consider what things preceded Esther 3. Well, the closing verses of Esther 2 recorded a plot to assassinate King Ahasuerus. Now, Mordecai, having learned of the plot, informed Esther, who then went to the king in verse 22 of chapter 2. Now, we read then that there was an inquisition made into the matter that resulted in 2 conspirators being hanged. And so, it was after these things that the king promoted a man by the name of Haman, the Agagite, and advanced him, and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. Now, the cause for Haman's promotion was not given. However, we learned that he was an Amalekite by birth, of royal lineage, and the Agagite, I'm hoping I'm saying that right, Agagite, was the title of Amalekite kings. And so Haman was a man of royal lineage. Now, Haman was consumed by the public adoration that was afforded him as a result of his promotion, and he proved to be a political opportunist who would stop at nothing to advance his political interests. Second only to King Ahasuerus commanded all the people of his realm in verse 2 to bow and reverence Haman. One man, however, would not violate his integrity and refused to bow to Haman. In verse 2 we read, and Mordecai bowed not, nor did him, Haman, reverence. Well, that set up a confrontation. And here we have in verses 3 through 6 what I have already described in the title as a wicked opportunist versus a man of integrity. Now all of the king's servants reverenced Haman as the king commanded, with one exception, and that was Mordecai, and he refused to bow, nor did Haman reverence. Now the king's servants noticed Mordecai's unbowed posture, and they demanded of him in verse 3, "Why transgresseth thou the king's commandment?" Well, Mordecai's refusal to bow to Haman continued until he was provoked to tell the king's servants in verse 4 that he was a Jew. When Haman learned that Mordecai refused to bow and pay him reverence, we read in verse 5 that he was full of wrath, and he plotted against Mordecai and all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. In other words, this man was angry with Mordecai, but he wasn't satisfied with merely dealing with Mordecai. He determined that he would genocide all of the Jews. Well, for 1 year, Haman and others confederated with him and plotted a time most advantageous to urge the king to purge Persia of Mordecai and his people in verse 7. So we read casting pur, which means casting lots. Haman believed fate would guide him to the day he could approach King Ahasuerus and seek his revenge against Haman. Well, 12 months later we read, Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered abroad, dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse or different from all people. Neither keep they the king's law. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer, that is, permit or allow them." Haman did not reveal his vendetta against Mordecai, but portrayed his cause as that was in the interest of the king in verse 8. Well, then offering silver to enrich the royal treasuries in verse 9, Haman petitioned the king to grant him authority to destroy all the Jews. Foolishly, King Ahasuerus heeded Haman's counsel and sealed the fate of the Jews with an irrevocable decree. Well, a closing thought. Provoked by one man's desire for revenge, all Persians were encouraged to, quote, destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day. Now, the king obviously had no knowledge that Esther, his beloved and beautiful wife, was of Jewish descent herself. Well, a question. Would Persia turn upon one people of its diverse population? And tragically, the answer was yes, for they were enticed to enrich themselves at the sacrifice of the Jews in verse 13 and take the spoil of them for a prey. Now, while news of the murderous decree spread throughout Persia's 127 provinces, we read in Esther 3 and verse 14 that the king and Haman sat down to drink. Haman did not know. His hatred of Mordecai and plot to eradicate the Jews would threaten the queen of Persia and become his undoing. Well, as we shall see, Mordecai's spiritual integrity provoked a national crisis and revealed God's sovereignty and providence in the lives of his people. Well, I'm going to end this devotional with to be continued. The plot does continue tomorrow, and I invite you to continue with me in our study of the book of Esther. God bless you, and bye-bye.